The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees outside the tall windows of Westfield University's science building. Dr. Eleanor Hayes adjusted her glasses and surveyed the classroom of 80 students, all hunched over notebooks or typing quietly on laptops. After 15 years of teaching advanced biochemistry, she had mastered the art of commanding respect without saying a word. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her lab coat was spotlessly white. Not a wrinkle in sight. "Today we'll be discussing protein synthesis," she announced, her voice carrying to the back row without effort. "Please open your textbooks to page 237. The familiar sound of pages turning filled the room, all except for one student sitting near the middle of the lecture hall. Dr. Hayes noticed him immediately, not because he was being disruptive, but because of the intense look of concentration on his face as he sketched something in a notebook that definitely wasn't the assigned textbook. The young man had started showing up in her class 3 weeks ago. Tall and lanky with dark hair that perpetually fell into his eyes, he wore the same faded blue hoodie almost every day. His name was Alex Chen, according to the class roster, a sophomore who had transferred from a state university on the West Coast. His academic record was impressive, nearly perfect scores in all his science courses, but Dr. Hayes had been teaching long enough to know that grades didn't always translate to classroom engagement. "Mr. Chen," she called out, her voice sharp enough to make several students jump. "Since you seem otherwise occupied, perhaps you'd like to explain to the class how mRNA codons determine amino acid sequencing?" The room went silent. 80 pairs of eyes turned toward Alex, who slowly looked up from his notebook. But instead of panic or embarrassment crossing his face, there was a flicker of something else. Interest. Maybe even excitement. "The mRNA molecule contains codons made up of 3 nucleotides," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "Each 3-letter code corresponds to a specific amino acid. The ribosome reads these codes in sequence to assemble the protein chain. But," he hesitated. "But what, Mr. Chen?" Dr. Hayes prompted, one eyebrow raised. "But the textbook explanation oversimplifies the process," he continued. "It doesn't account for how environmental factors can influence protein folding after synthesis, which can completely change the function regardless of the amino acid sequence." Murmur rippled through the classroom. Dr. Hayes felt a prickle of surprise. The boy had clearly done his reading beyond the assigned materials. Most students struggled just to memorize the basic process. "That's more advanced than where we are in the curriculum, Mr. Chen. But you're not wrong," she conceded. "We'll get to protein folding next week. For now, let's stick to the basics of synthesis." She turned back to the whiteboard, but from the corner of her eye she saw Alex return to his notebook, scribbling even more intensely than before. After class, while students filed out in chattering groups, Dr. Hayes noticed Alex lingering behind, carefully placing his notebook in a worn backpack. "Mr. Chen, may I have a word?" she called, organizing papers at her desk. He approached cautiously, like someone unsure of whether they were in trouble. "That was an interesting point you raised today," she said. "Have you studied biochemistry before?" Alex shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Not formally. I just read a lot. What were you working on during class?" She nodded toward his backpack. "It seemed to have your complete attention." For the first time, a hint of color appeared in his cheeks. "Just some ideas. About protein folding, actually. Ideas that couldn't wait until after my lecture." Her tone was stern, but there was a hint of curiosity behind it. "I'm sorry," he said, though he didn't sound particularly sorry. "When I get thinking about something, it's hard to stop." "I was listening, though." Dr. Hayes studied him for a moment. In 15 years of teaching, she'd encountered brilliant students, dedicated students, rebellious students. But there was something different about Alex Chen, a quiet intensity that didn't fit neatly into any category she was familiar with. "Next time, try to at least pretend to look at the textbook," she said finally. "And I'd be interested to see these ideas of yours sometime if you're willing to share them." A look of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by a cautious smile. "Really? Really? My office hours are Tuesdays and Thursdays 3 to 5. After Alex left, Dr. Hayes sat at her desk for a long moment. There had been something in that notebook that had completely absorbed the young man's attention. In her experience, students who ignored lectures were usually scrolling through social media or texting friends. But Alex had been creating something. The next day's class went much the same way. Dr. Hayes lectured on metabolic pathways while Alex alternated between taking notes and returning to his mysterious project. This time, she didn't call him out. By Friday, curiosity had gotten the better of her. After dismissing the class, she approached Alex's desk before he could pack up and leave. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to his notebook. He hesitated, then slowly turned it toward her. What she saw wasn't what she expected. Instead of notes or doodles, the pages were filled with complex molecular diagrams and mathematical equations. Some were crossed out, others circled with question marks beside them. It looked like the work of a graduate student or even a researcher, not a sophomore undergraduate. "What exactly are you trying to figure out here?" she asked, genuinely intrigued. Alex ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "I think there might be a way to visualize protein folding in real time without using the standard fluorescent markers. The current methods alter the protein's natural behavior, so we're never seeing the true process." Dr. Hayes blinked in surprise. This was graduate-level thinking, possibly even publication-worthy if he was onto something real. "And how would you do that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "That's what I'm still working out." He tapped his pencil against one of the equations. "It would need a different kind of sensor, something that doesn't interfere with the molecular interactions." For the first time in years, Dr. Hayes felt a spark of true academic excitement. This wasn't just a good student reciting memorized information. This was original thinking. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" "Professor Williams in the research department might be interested." Alex shook his head. "I don't really know any of the professors here yet. I just transferred this semester." "Well, now you know me," Dr. Hayes said decisively, "and I think this deserves some attention. Why don't you come to my office hours next Tuesday? We can discuss this further." The look of genuine surprise and pleasure on Alex's face made Dr. Hayes remember why she had become a teacher in the first place, to witness that moment when a young mind caught fire with the possibility of discovery. Over the weekend, she found herself thinking about Alex's notebook. In her early days as a researcher, before the demands of teaching and department politics had taken over, she had felt that same burning need to solve a problem, to see something no one else had seen before. Somewhere along the way, that fire had dimmed to comfortable embers. On Monday morning, she arrived at her office earlier than usual and pulled several research journals from her bookshelf. By the time her first class began, she had sticky notes marking pages about recent developments in protein visualization techniques. She wasn't sure if Alex's idea had merit, but she was suddenly eager to find out. During Tuesday's lecture, she noticed Alex was more engaged, actually taking notes on the day's topic, enzyme kinetics, though he still occasionally turned to a fresh page to work on his own project. When he answered a question about activation energy with unusual clarity, she saw several other students looking at him with new respect. When office hours came, Dr. Hayes found herself watching the clock. At 3:15, there was a knock on her door. "Come in," she called, closing the journal she'd been reading. Alex entered, looking slightly more put together than usual. He'd swapped the blue hoodie for a button-down shirt, though it was wrinkled as if it had been pulled from the bottom of a drawer. "I brought the rest of my notes," he said, pulling a folder from his backpack. "And I've been thinking about what you said regarding Professor Williams. Do you really think he might be interested?" "Let's see what you've got first," Dr. Hayes said, clearing a space on her desk. "Then we can decide next steps." As Alex spread out his work and began explaining his theory in detail, Dr. Hayes felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, the thrill of scientific possibility. Whatever came of this unusual student's ideas, she had a feeling that the comfortable routine of her teaching life was about to be shaken up, and surprisingly, she found herself looking forward to it. 2 weeks passed, and the relationship between Dr. Hayes and Alex evolved into something unexpected. What had begun as simple curiosity on her part had grown into genuine academic interest. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Alex would arrive promptly at 3 o'clock, his folder stuffed with new ideas and calculations. Together, they would dissect his theories, Dr. Hayes pointing out flaws in his reasoning or suggesting alternative approaches when he hit a wall. But as midterms approached, she noticed a troubling shift. While Alex remained engaged during their office meetings, his classroom participation had begun to slide. Where once he had at least made an effort to follow along with lectures, now he spent entire class periods absorbed in his own work. barely looking up when she wrote key concepts on the board. On a particularly chilly October morning, Dr. Hayes decided it was time to address the issue head-on. The lecture that day covered a critical concept that would feature prominently on the midterm exam. The rate-limiting step in a metabolic pathway is crucial to understanding how cells regulate energy production, she explained, drawing a complex diagram on the whiteboard. Can anyone tell me why this matters in pharmaceutical development? Several hands went up, the usual suspects, students who always participated. Dr. Hayes let her gaze drift to where Alex sat, head bent over his notebook as always. Mr. Chen, she called out, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on this topic? The classroom went quiet. Alex looked up slowly, blinking as if emerging from a deep daydream. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? A few students snickered. Dr. Hayes felt a flicker of disappointment. I asked about the relevance of rate-limiting steps to pharmaceutical development, she said, her voice cooler than usual, a topic we've been discussing for the past 20 minutes. Alex straightened in his seat. Oh. Well, if you can identify the rate-limiting enzyme in a metabolic pathway, you can design drugs that target specifically that step, which gives you more control over the entire process. It's more efficient than trying to affect multiple points in the pathway. His answer was correct, but delivered with such indifference that it set Dr. Hayes's teeth on edge. This wasn't the enthusiastic young man who filled her office with rapid-fire questions and innovative ideas. That's the textbook answer, Mr. Chen, she said, but I was hoping for some deeper insight. Given your apparent interest in biochemistry, she saw something flash across his face. Embarrassment, perhaps, or frustration, before he dropped his gaze back to his notebook. The rest of the class shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Hayes continued with the lecture, but the exchange had left her unsettled. After class, she waited until the last students had filed out before calling Alex back. A word, please. He approached her desk, backpack slung over one shoulder. Up close, she could see the dark circles under his eyes. Is everything all right, Mr. Chen? You seem distracted today. Alex ran a hand through his hair, making it stand up even more than usual. I'm fine. Just tired. Been working late on our project. Dr. Hayes had begun to think of his protein visualization idea as a joint endeavor, though she was still primarily acting as a sounding board and guide. Yeah, I think I'm getting close to something that might actually work. There was a hint of his usual enthusiasm, but it was muted by exhaustion. That's commendable, but not at the expense of your other coursework, she said firmly. Your midterm is in 2 weeks, and based on what I saw today, you're not prepared. I know the material, he protested. I've read the textbook cover to cover. Twice. Reading is not the same as understanding, and understanding is not the same as being able to apply concepts in an exam setting. You need to focus, Alex. It was the first time she had used his first name, and they both noticed it. The formality that usually characterized their interactions shifted slightly. I'm sorry, he said, sounding genuinely contrite. I'll do better. It's just, when I get an idea, it's hard to think about anything else until I've worked through it. Dr. Hayes understood this all too well. In her younger days as a researcher, she had fallen into the same trap, becoming so fixated on a problem that everything else fell away. It had cost her sleep, relationships, and at times her health. I understand passion for a project, she said, her tone softening, but part of being a successful scientist is learning to balance that passion with other responsibilities. The foundation you're building now in your coursework will serve you even in your independent research. Alex nodded, though she wasn't sure her words were truly sinking in. The midterm counts for 30% of your final grade, she reminded him, and there's also the presentation component. Have you given any thought to what standard reaction you'll be demonstrating? All students were required to present a biochemical reaction for the practical portion of the midterm. They would be graded on technique, understanding of the underlying principles, and their ability to explain the process to the class. I was thinking about doing the phosphorylase kinase cascade, Alex said, mentioning one of the more complex options on the approved list. Dr. Hayes raised an eyebrow. An ambitious choice. You'll need to practice the procedure several times to get it right. I will, he promised. Starting this weekend, see that you do. And perhaps consider spending a little less time on our side project until after midterms. It will still be there in 3 weeks. Alex nodded again, but as he turned to leave, Dr. Hayes caught a glimpse of the open notebook in his hands. The page was covered in new diagrams and calculations. Whatever breakthrough he thought he was approaching, it clearly had a powerful hold on him. The following week brought no improvement. If anything, Alex seemed even more detached during lectures. Twice, Dr. Hayes had to repeat questions directed at him, and his answers, while technically correct, lacked depth. Other students had begun to exchange glances whenever she called on him, as if sharing a private joke. During Thursday's office hours, she confronted him again. "Your participation grade is suffering," she said bluntly, pushing aside the protein folding models they had been discussing. "And I'm concerned about your readiness for the midterm presentation." Alex looked genuinely surprised. "But I've been doing all the reading, and I've practiced the kinase cascade procedure in the open lab hours. Being physically present in class while your mind is elsewhere doesn't count as participation. Mr. Chen," she had reverted to using his surname, signaling her disappointment, "and based on what I've observed, you've spent more time on this visualization project than on preparing for my exam." For the first time since she had known him, Alex showed a flash of anger. "With all due respect, Dr. Hayes, you were the one who encouraged me to pursue this project in the first place. You said it had potential. I encouraged you to explore an interesting idea alongside your regular studies, not to the exclusion of them," she countered. "There's a difference." They stared at each other across the desk, an unexpected tension filling the small office. Finally, Alex looked away. "I'll be ready for the midterm," he said quietly, "both the written exam and the presentation." Dr. Hayes wanted to believe him, but the stubborn set of his jaw told her that nothing had really changed. He would continue pouring his energy into his project, giving only the minimum required attention to her class. "I hope so," she said, "because I'd hate to see a student with your potential fail due to lack of focus." The weekend passed and Monday's class was marginally better. Alex made a visible effort to participate, raising his hand twice to answer questions. But by Wednesday, he had slipped back into his old pattern, hunched over his notebook while Dr. Hayes lectured on enzyme inhibition. After class, she stopped him as he was packing up. "The lab will be set up for practice sessions tonight and tomorrow night," she reminded him. "I strongly suggest you take advantage of that time to perfect your presentation technique." "I will," he said, not meeting her eyes. But when Dr. Hayes checked the lab sign-in sheet the next morning, Alex's name wasn't on it. With a sigh of frustration, she decided to make one final attempt to reach him before the midterm. She sent him an email asking him to come to her office that afternoon, outside her regular office hours. To her surprise, he replied promptly, agreeing to meet at 2:00. When he arrived, she noticed immediately that something was different. There was an energy about him that had been missing in recent weeks. Not the exhausted intensity she had grown accustomed to, but something lighter, almost joyful. "You wanted to see me, Dr. Hayes?" he asked, taking the chair opposite her desk without being asked. "Yes, Mr. Chen. I wanted to check in on your preparation for tomorrow's midterm presentation." "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about," he said, opening his backpack and pulling out not his usual notebook, but a neatly typed proposal. "I'd like to request permission to present an alternative demonstration." Dr. Hayes frowned. The approved list of reactions was distributed at the beginning of the semester. Everyone has had ample time to prepare one of those options. "I know, but this would be more relevant to current research." He slid the proposal across her desk. "It's a demonstration of my protein visualization method. I've worked out the details and I believe I can show real-time folding without disrupting the natural process." Dr. Hayes stared at him in disbelief. "You want to present an unproven experimental technique instead of a standard established reaction? For your midterm?" "It's not entirely unproven," Alex said, his eyes bright with excitement. "I ran a successful trial in the graduate research lab last night. Professor Williams let me use the equipment after hours." "You went to Professor Williams without telling me?" Dr. Hayes felt an irrational pang of betrayal. "You suggested I talk to him weeks ago," Alex reminded her. "I finally took your advice. He was really interested in the concept and gave me access to some equipment I needed." Dr. Hayes picked up the proposal, scanning the methodology section. What Alex was suggesting was unorthodox, to say the least. If it failed during the presentation, it would be embarrassing for both of them. But if it worked... "This is highly irregular," she said finally. "I know," Alex admitted. But isn't that how science moves forward? By trying new approaches? She could almost hear her younger self making the same argument to her own professors years ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. The midterm is designed to test your understanding of established principles, not your ability to innovate, she said, though with less conviction than she intended. But I can explain all the established principles that make this new approach possible, Alex countered. I'm not skipping anything, I'm building on it. Dr. Hayes studied him for a long moment. The passionate, engaged student she had glimpsed in their early meetings was fully present now, practically vibrating with enthusiasm. Whatever he had discovered during his late-night lab session had rekindled his fire. Against her better judgment, she found herself nodding slowly. All right, Mr. Chen. You may present your alternative demonstration tomorrow. But, she held up a warning finger, you must be prepared to explain the fundamental biochemical principles involved, just as you would with a standard reaction. This isn't just about showing off something flashy. Of course, he agreed quickly. Thank you, Dr. Hayes, you won't regret this. As he gathered his things and practically bounded out of her office, Dr. Hayes wasn't so sure. 15 years of following protocol had served her well. Bending the rules for one unusual student felt like stepping onto uncertain ground. Yet as she reviewed his proposal more carefully, she couldn't help feeling a flutter of excitement herself. If Alex had truly found a way to visualize protein folding without altering the process, it could be a significant contribution to the field. Tomorrow would reveal whether she had made a terrible mistake or given a brilliant young mind the chance to shine. Either way, the midterm presentation was certain to be unlike any other in her teaching career. The morning of the midterm presentations dawned cold and clear. Dr. Hayes arrived at the biochemistry lab an hour early to ensure everything was properly set up. 23 stations were arranged around the large room, each equipped with the standard materials students would need for their demonstrations. The familiar routine of preparation usually calmed her nerves before evaluation days. But this morning, an unusual tension knotted between her shoulder blades. She checked her watch, then glanced at the door for the 5th time in as many minutes. Alex had promised to come early to set up his unorthodox demonstration, but there was still no sign of him. With a sigh, she began reviewing her grading sheets, trying to focus on the task at hand rather than worrying about one unpredictable student. At precisely 7:45, 15 minutes before class was scheduled to begin, the door swung open. Alex entered, pushing a cart loaded with equipment that definitely wasn't part of the standard lab inventory. A sleek microscope was mounted on one end, connected to a laptop computer. Several small containers were carefully arranged beside it, along with what appeared to be a custom-built apparatus featuring a series of thin glass tubes. Good morning, Dr. Hayes, he said, sounding surprisingly cheerful for someone who had likely been up most of the night. Where would you like me to set up? She pointed to the station nearest the main demonstration table. There, and please be quick about it. Other students will be arriving soon. As Alex began assembling his equipment, Dr. Hayes found herself torn between curiosity and apprehension. The setup looked professional enough, but it was unlike anything she had seen used for undergraduate demonstrations. She was beginning to regret her moment of weakness in approving this deviation from the standard curriculum. Mr. Chen, she said, approaching his station, I need to remind you that if your demonstration doesn't work, or if you can't adequately explain the underlying principles, I won't be able to give you a passing grade simply for creativity. Alex nodded without looking up from his work. It'll work, he said with quiet confidence, and I can explain every step of the process. Before she could respond, the door opened again and students began filtering into the lab, their faces a mixture of anxiety and determination, typical of midterm day. They moved to their assigned stations, glancing curiously at Alex's unusual setup as they passed. Good morning, everyone, Dr. Hayes called, bringing the class to attention. As you know, today you'll be presenting your midterm demonstrations. Each of you has prepared one of the standard reactions from the approved list, and you'll have 10 minutes to perform your demonstration and explain the biochemical principles involved. She paused, debating whether to mention Alex's special permission, then decided against it. Better to let the presentations proceed normally and deal with any questions when they arose. We'll go in alphabetical order by last name, she announced. Ms. Anderson, you're first. The presentations began smoothly enough. Lily Anderson demonstrated the hydrolysis of sucrose with impressive precision. Ben Baker followed with a solid presentation on enzyme inhibition, though his explanation of competitive versus non-competitive inhibition was a bit muddled. Dr. Hayes made careful notes on her grading sheet, pushing thoughts of Alex's upcoming demonstration to the back of her mind. By the time they reached the C's, the rhythm of the class was well established. Most students performed competently, if not brilliantly, showing a basic grasp of the principles they had studied throughout the semester. Mr. Chen, Dr. Hayes called when Tom Carlson had finished his presentation on oxidative phosphorylation. "You're next." The room grew quieter than it had been all morning. Word had evidently spread that Alex was doing something different, and curiosity had overcome pre-midterm anxiety. Even students who normally paid little attention were watching with interest as Alex moved to the front of the room. "For my demonstration," he began, his voice steady despite the attention, "I'll be showing a new method for visualizing protein folding in real time." A murmur rippled through the class. Dr. Hayes felt her heartbeat quicken. This was the moment of truth. "As we've learned this semester, proteins must fold into specific three-dimensional shapes to function correctly," Alex continued. "Current visualization methods rely on fluorescent markers or tags that can potentially alter the folding process. What I'm going to show you today is a technique that allows us to observe natural folding without interference." He turned to his equipment, powering on the laptop and adjusting the microscope with practiced movements. Dr. Hayes was surprised by his composure. In class he often seemed distracted or awkward, but here, presenting his own research, he moved with confidence. "The key innovation is this sensor array," he explained, indicating the glass tube apparatus. "Instead of attaching markers to the protein itself, this system creates a field that can detect structural changes based on minute electrical variations. The protein remains completely unmodified." Dr. Hayes found herself leaning forward slightly, professional concern momentarily forgotten in the face of genuine scientific curiosity. If what Alex was claiming was true, it would indeed be significant. "For today's demonstration, I'll be using a simple protein, lysozyme, which has a well-documented folding pattern. This will allow us to compare what we observe with established models." He carefully pipetted a clear solution into the main chamber of his apparatus. The class watched in silence as he made final adjustments to the microscope and tapped a few commands into the laptop. "The visualization software translates the electrical field data into a three-dimensional model we can observe in real time," he explained. "What you're seeing on screen now is the initial, unfolded state of the lysozyme protein." The laptop display, which had been projected onto the whiteboard for the class to see, showed what looked like a loose, random chain. Dr. Hayes recognized it as an accurate representation of an unfolded protein, though she was still skeptical about how Alex was generating this image. "Now, I'll introduce the folding catalyst, in this case, a simple pH change that mimics the cellular environment where this protein naturally folds." Alex added a few drops of another solution to the chamber. For a moment, nothing happened. Dr. Hayes felt a twinge of both sympathy and vindication. Perhaps the demonstration would fail after all, proving her initial reservations correct. Then the image on the screen began to change. Slowly at first, then with gathering speed the chaotic chain began to fold, twisting and turning into a compact structure that was unmistakably the characteristic shape of lysozyme. The whole process took less than 30 seconds, but the transformation was remarkable to witness. Dr. Hayes stared in amazement. In 15 years of teaching biochemistry, she had never seen protein folding visualized with such clarity and apparent accuracy. The standard models and animations she used in her lectures were pale approximations compared to the dynamic, detailed process playing out on the screen. "What you just witnessed," Alex said into the stunned silence that followed, "is the complete folding pathway of lysozyme, from primary structure to its final tertiary structure, without any artificial markers or modifications that might influence the process." He looked toward Dr. Hayes, a question in his eyes. She realized he was waiting for her to signal whether he should continue or conclude his presentation. She nodded almost imperceptibly, her mind racing with questions and implications. "The traditional view of protein folding," Alex went on, growing more animated, "suggests a funnel-like energy landscape where proteins fold along a relatively predictable path. But what we're seeing with this visualization method is that the process is more complex. There are multiple pathways and intermediate states that current models don't account for. He tapped a key on his laptop, and the screen split to show a comparison between the textbook model of lysozyme folding and what his apparatus had just recorded. The differences were subtle but undeniable. "Notice these intermediate structures here and here," he said, pointing to specific moments in the folding process. "According to our textbook, these shouldn't exist. The protein should move directly from this state to its final conformation. But we can clearly see these transitional forms." Dr. Hayes felt a chill run down her spine. What Alex was showing contradicted not just the simplified models used in undergraduate teaching, but some of the fundamental assumptions in current protein folding research. If his method was valid, and the evidence before her eyes suggested it was, several well-established papers in the field, including 2 she had co-authored early in her career, would need significant revision. "For my second demonstration," Alex continued, seemingly oblivious to the bombshell he had just dropped, "I'll show how this same technique can be applied to observe the effects of denaturants on protein structure." He prepared a new sample, this time adding a solution that Dr. Hayes recognized as a common protein denaturant. On the screen, they watched as a fully folded protein gradually unraveled, its complex structure collapsing into a disordered chain. "The conventional wisdom," Alex explained, "is that denaturation is essentially the reverse of folding. A protein simply loses its structure and reverts to a random coil. But if we observe carefully—" He slowed down the recording and zoomed in on a particular segment. "We can see that the protein doesn't unfold randomly. There's a specific sequence of structural losses, and certain core sections resist denaturation longer than others." Again, what he was showing directly contradicted the simplified models presented in textbooks, including the one Dr. Hayes had assigned for her course. "This has significant implications for our understanding of protein stability, and for the development of therapeutics targeting misfolded proteins," Alex concluded. "Conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and prion diseases all involve protein misfolding. If we can better understand the precise mechanics of folding and unfolding, we might develop more effective treatments." He stopped the recording and turned to face the class fully. "Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions about the methodology or the implications of these observations." The room remained silent for several seconds. Then hands began shooting up all around the lab. Even students who rarely participated in class discussions seemed eager to learn more about what they had just witnessed. Dr. Hayes should have been pleased by this unprecedented level of engagement. Instead, she found herself frozen in place, her grading sheet forgotten in her hand. The implications of Alex's demonstration were still washing over her, wave after wave of realizations about what this might mean for the field, and for her own understanding of a subject she had taught for a decade and a half. If Alex's method was reproducible, if other researchers could achieve the same level of detailed visualization, it would transform their understanding of one of the most fundamental processes in biochemistry. Papers would need to be rewritten. Textbooks would become obsolete overnight. Research priorities would shift. And all of this had been developed not by a seasoned researcher with years of specialized training, but by an undergraduate student who couldn't be bothered to pay attention in her lectures. As questions continued to pour from the suddenly animated class, Dr. Hayes found herself mentally reviewing every interaction she'd had with Alex over the past weeks. His distraction during lectures, his absorption in his own notes, they took on a different meaning now. He hadn't been disrespecting her course. He had simply moved beyond it, pursuing a line of inquiry that rendered much of what she was teaching outdated. The thought was both humbling and disturbing. For 15 years, she had considered herself at the cutting edge of her field, priding herself on incorporating the latest research into her teaching. Now, in the span of a 10-minute demonstration, a sophomore transfer student had shown her how limited her perspective had become. A particular question from the back of the room finally broke through her daze. "How does this compare to the crystallography methods we learned about last week?" asked a student whose name escaped Dr. Hayes in her current state of shock. Before Alex could answer, Dr. Hayes found herself stepping forward. "What Mr. Chen has shown us today," she said, her voice sounding distant to her own ears, "appears to overcome many of the limitations inherent in crystallography and other static imaging techniques. While those methods can give us detailed snapshots of protein structure, they cannot capture the dynamic process of folding as we've just witnessed." She paused, aware that every eye in the room was now on her, including Alex's. "If this methodology proves reproducible, and I emphasize if, as independent verification is a cornerstone of scientific progress, it would represent a significant advance in our understanding of protein dynamics." The words felt inadequate even as she spoke them. Significant advance hardly captured the potential paradigm shift they had just witnessed, but she needed time to process, to think through the implications without the expectation of 23 students hanging on her response. "I believe that concludes our scheduled time for Mr. Chen's presentation," she said, glancing at her watch, though she had lost all track of time. "We'll take a 5-minute break before continuing with the remaining demonstrations." As students clustered around Alex's station, peppering him with questions, Dr. Hayes walked to her desk at the front of the room. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her papers, a physical manifestation of the mental earthquake she was experiencing. 15 years of teaching, dozens of published papers, hundreds of lectures on protein structure and function, and in 10 minutes, a student who couldn't be bothered to follow the standard midterm guidelines had called it all into question. Dr. Hayes looked back at the crowd around Alex's station. He was explaining some aspect of his methodology to an enthralled group, his hands moving animatedly as he described the sensor array. For the first time, she saw him not as a problem student who needed to be brought in line, but as a fellow scientist, perhaps one with the potential to eclipse her own contributions to the field. The realization was both painful and exhilarating. Science moved forward through exactly this kind of disruption, this challenging of established wisdom. She had known this intellectually, had taught it to her students year after year, but experiencing it firsthand, watching as a fundamental aspect of her field was potentially rewritten before her eyes, was something else entirely. Dr. Hayes took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and did something she had never done in 15 years of teaching. She walked out of her classroom in the middle of a session, leaving 23 stunned students staring after her. The hallway outside the biochemistry lab felt unnaturally quiet after Dr. Hayes pulled the door shut behind her. For a moment, she simply stood there, back pressed against the wall, eyes closed, trying to steady her breathing. In 15 years of teaching, through student meltdowns, lab accidents, and even a small fire during a particularly ambitious senior project, she had never walked out of a class. Yet here she was, heart racing, hands slightly shaking, standing in an empty hallway while 23 students waited for her return. Or perhaps they weren't waiting at all. Perhaps Alex had simply continued his impromptu lecture, stepping effortlessly into the void she had created with her abrupt departure. The thought sent a fresh wave of emotion through her. Not quite anger, not quite fear, but something unsettling that made her chest tight. She pushed away from the wall and began walking, not with any destination in mind, just needing to move, to put physical distance between herself and what had just happened in that lab. Her footsteps echoed in the empty corridor. Most classes were in session at this hour, and the science building was quieter than usual. She passed closed doors behind which other professors were no doubt conducting their classes with perfect composure, maintaining the orderly flow of academic life that she had just disrupted. She found herself climbing the stairs to the 3rd floor, where the faculty offices were located. Her own office beckoned like a sanctuary, a place where she could close the door and process what had just happened without an audience. But as she reached for her keys, she hesitated. Running to her office felt too much like hiding, like an admission of defeat or distress that she wasn't ready to make even to herself. Instead, she continued down the hallway until she reached a small faculty lounge at the end. It was empty, as she had hoped it would be at this hour. She sank into one of the worn armchairs by the window, looking out over the campus quad where students moved between buildings, their lives continuing in perfect ignorance of her professional crisis. What exactly had happened in that lab? On the surface, it was simple enough. A student had performed an impressive demonstration that contradicted some established teachings. But something about Alex's presentation had shaken her more deeply than mere academic disagreement could explain. It wasn't just that his visualization method seemed to invalidate certain aspects of protein folding theory. It was the sudden, jarring realization that while she had been carefully maintaining the established order of her classroom, meticulously teaching what she believed to be cutting-edge concepts, a student had been quietly working toward a breakthrough that could render parts of her life's work obsolete. The irony was almost painful. She had encouraged Alex to pursue his ideas, had even introduced him to Professor Williams in the research department. She had seen potential in his work. So why did witnessing the fruits of that potential leave her feeling so displaced? A memory surfaced, herself as a young researcher, presenting findings at a conference that contradicted the work of a senior professor in the field. She remembered the man's face as he listened from the front row, how his expression had shifted from polite interest to barely concealed distress, as she methodically dismantled theories he had spent decades developing. At the time, she had felt only the thrill of discovery, the righteous confidence of someone advancing the boundaries of human knowledge. She had not spared much thought for what it might feel like to be on the receiving end of such advancement. Now she knew. The sound of the faculty lounge door opening jolted her from her thoughts. Professor Williams stood in the doorway, looking mildly surprised to find her there. "Eleanor," he said, his bushy eyebrows rising slightly, "I thought you had midterm presentations this morning." "I did." "I do," she corrected herself. "I'm just taking a short break." He gave her a look that suggested he didn't quite believe this explanation, but was too polite to press the matter. Instead, he moved to the coffee machine in the corner and began preparing a fresh pot. "I met that student of yours," he said conversationally, as he measured coffee grounds. "Alex Chen. Remarkable young man." Of course he would bring up Alex. Dr. Hayes felt a flicker of the same unnerving emotion that had driven her from the classroom. "Yes, he is. He showed me his protein visualization setup last night. Quite ingenious, really. If it works as well as our initial tests suggest, it could be a game changer." Professor Williams turned to face her, leaning against the counter while the coffee brewed. "I've already mentioned it to some colleagues at the National Institute. They're interested in seeing a demonstration." Dr. Hayes nodded, not trusting herself to speak. So it wasn't just her imagination or a momentary overreaction. Alex's work really was as significant as it had seemed. "I understand he presented it to your class this morning," Professor Williams continued. "How did that go?" How indeed. She could hardly explain that she had fled her own classroom rather than face the implications of her student's breakthrough. "It was impressive," she managed. "The students were quite engaged. I'm not surprised. It's not often undergraduates get to witness cutting-edge research in action." He poured coffee into a mug, then offered her one with a questioning glance. She shook her head. "I have to say, Eleanor, you've done a remarkable job mentoring him. When he first came to me, he mentioned how much your guidance had helped shape his thinking on the project. This was unexpected." "He said that? Oh, yes." "Gave you a good deal of credit for helping him refine his approach. Said you'd encouraged him to pursue the idea when others might have dismissed it as too ambitious for an undergraduate." A complicated mix of emotions washed over Dr. Hayes. Pride, certainly. It was gratifying to hear that Alex valued her guidance, but also confusion and a touch of guilt. Had she truly been as supportive as he suggested? Or had she merely tolerated his extracurricular interests while focusing primarily on keeping him in line with the standard curriculum? "That was generous of him," she said finally. "Though I think he's giving me too much credit." "The concept was entirely his," Professor Williams shrugged. "Maybe so, but good ideas need nurturing. Not every professor would take the time to work with a student on a project outside the established curriculum, especially one that challenges some fundamental assumptions in the field." There was no criticism in his tone, but the words struck uncomfortably close to the doubts that had been swirling in her mind. Had she really nurtured Alex's ideas, or had she merely failed to squelch them? "Speaking of which," Professor Williams continued, glancing at his watch, "shouldn't you be getting back to your class? I imagine they're wondering where you've gone." The gentle reminder was like a splash of cold water, bringing her sharply back to the reality of her situation. She had left 23 students unattended in the middle of a midterm examination. Whatever personal crisis she was experiencing, Her professional responsibilities couldn't simply be abandoned. "Yes, of course," she said, rising from the armchair. "I just needed a moment to collect my thoughts." Professor Williams nodded sympathetically. Paradigm shifts can be disorienting even when you see them coming, and they rarely announce themselves in advance. As she moved toward the door, he called after her, "By the way, I'd like to discuss the possibility of setting up a more formal research arrangement for Alex. Perhaps a special project course or even a summer fellowship. We should talk about it when you have more time." Dr. Hayes nodded and murmured something affirmative, but her mind was already racing ahead to what awaited her back in the lab. How would she explain her unprecedented departure? What would the students think? What would Alex think? The walk back to the biochemistry lab seemed both too long and far too short. With each step, she tried to compose herself, to recapture the professional demeanor that had been her armor for 15 years. By the time she reached the door, her breathing was steady and her expression carefully neutral. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, prepared for stares of confusion or judgment. Instead, she found the class proceeding in perfect order. The next student in the alphabetical sequence was in the middle of demonstrating enzyme catalysis, speaking confidently about reaction rates while her classmates took notes. It was as if Dr. Hayes had never left. Only as she moved toward her desk at the front of the room did she notice the difference. The students, normally arranged in a loose semicircle around the demonstration table, had subtly shifted their positioning. They were now oriented toward a point at the side of the room, where Alex stood beside his equipment, quietly observing the current presentation. When the presenting student finished her demonstration, she looked not toward Dr. Hayes for approval or feedback, but toward Alex, who gave her an encouraging nod. A whispered exchange passed between them that Dr. Hayes couldn't quite catch, but it had the distinct feel of one colleague advising another. In the span of 20 minutes, the length of time she had been gone, the dynamic of the classroom had shifted. Alex had somehow stepped into the role of authority without actively claiming it. The other students had naturally gravitated toward him, perhaps drawn by the still fresh excitement of his presentation, or perhaps simply filling the vacuum left by her absence. Dr. Hayes cleared her throat. "Thank you, Ms. Davis, for that thorough demonstration. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Evans." The class's attention snapped back to her, a collective look of mild surprise crossing their faces, as if they had momentarily forgotten she was supposed to be there. Even Alex seemed startled, though he quickly recovered and moved back to his station, stepping out of the spotlight as smoothly as he had apparently stepped into it. The remaining presentations proceeded without incident. Dr. Hayes took careful notes, asked appropriate questions, and gave no outward sign of the turmoil she had experienced earlier. But her awareness of the room had changed. She could feel the students' attention divided, shifting between her and Alex, who remained quietly attentive at his station, occasionally nodding or offering a small smile of encouragement to his classmates. When the final presentation concluded, Dr. Hayes addressed the class with what she hoped was her usual air of calm authority. "Thank you all for your demonstrations today. I'm impressed by the level of preparation and understanding shown by most of you. Your grades will be posted by the end of the week." She began gathering her papers, preparing to dismiss the class. "Mr. Chen, would you stay behind for a moment? I'd like to discuss your presentation."